I don't think many people realize how large the railroad camps were, where you'd have 1,000 or almost 1,000 people together living in temporary buildings, these little 1- and 2-room huts, as they used to call them, that might have 5 or 6 people sharing the space to sleep. They'd sleep almost like on a ship, where you'd have a watch or a rotation. So while a couple of men were out working on their area, some others might be sleeping in the hut, and then they would switch off. And from day to day, it wasn't like going to a 9-to-5 job. You were taken by a contractor and you were brought out to do a particular fill or cut or clear logs or whatever was needed for that particular section of the line. So it was not the same job day after day, but it was work day after day. And it was all done with hand labor. The Western Railroad did employ the steam shovel, the first building operation in all of the world, not just in the United States, to use a steam shovel, but the tool could only work in light soils. So when they got as far as Wilbraham, everything bogged down and it all reverted back to hand work, manual labor. Something else that people don't realize is the vast majority of the workmen were married. So they were here with their wives, and some of them brought their children, and many children were born here in Massachusetts along the rail line. So it was an entire community. It wasn't just a village of bachelors like we might think about in an immigrant camp. The workers were not allowed, technically, although a little of it did happen, they were not allowed to have interaction with the locals. The legislature in Massachusetts was very strict with the railroad about making sure the workers would be separate. So all of your needs, if you were hired, had to be provided by the contractor and by the railroad, from your meat and cheese and drink. And definitely it was not distilled liquor, it was not hard spirits, technically. All of that had to be provided to you, right down to the plates and knives and forks, and everything you needed for your daily life was provided, because you're out in these isolated areas. Here, close to the Chester Depot, you had the largest encampment at the foot of Gobble Mountain. And there's still some traces of that out in the woods that have grown up. But you have to think that in the day, it was so much more deforested. And what was not deforested when the workers got here, they had to complete, they had to do before extending the line. Another point about working on the rail line that I find very interesting is it wasn't, as we would expect, built in succession or in progression. You didn't start on the east side and worked west. The entire line had been surveyed and sections laid out, and depending on the terrain, the section might be a mile, it might be 3 miles, it might be 5 miles, and then each one of those sections was put out to bids by contractors. So section 53 and section 98 might be under construction at the same time. It wasn't 50, 51, 52, 53. And it's amazing when you look at how the line was completed that it actually all did line up. And that has a lot to do with the engineering and the survey and the prep work before any shovel or spade was even put in the ground.
How about recruitment for the jobs?
The railroad was built with manual labor.
Let's back up.
Oh, okay.
The Western. Okay.
What's that?
The Western. Let's recognize the Western. Okay.
Oh, the Western Railroad?
Yeah.
The Great Western Railroad.
Yeah, there you go.
The Massachusetts Great Western Railroad, which was going to run from Worcester, that had been the terminus of the first line, was going to require a huge amount of manual labor. Some of it was available on the native soil of Massachusetts, definitely not by Yankee workmen, not by farmers for the most part. but for common laborers. So they recruited what they could, but knew they needed a larger workforce. So they actually took advertisements out in newspapers in Ireland, in places like Dublin and Cork, asking for workers. This model really had been created during the building time of the canals, which precede the railroad. So they knew that this would work, and they knew that the unemployment rate for common labor in Ireland was 35%. So they knew that there was a workforce there that wanted some means to take care of their families. And this was long before the Irish famine. This is not a potato famine phenomenon. This is something that came beforehand. So they found a large willing workforce that could come over here and blend in with the individuals that were here and were from other countries. Much of the stonework was actually completed by contractors, especially of Scottish heritage. You find the cuts and the fills and the laying of the lines done by Irish, but some of the specialty work, like being teamsters and blacksmiths and stonework, were done typically by other ethnic groups.
And at that point, the Yankees really didn't have the experience to the degree of working with rock. Is that correct?
Right. There had been much work done in the creation of the highways and in farms in New England, but not to the degree that you're looking for in these large civic projects like the canals and like the railroads. So they needed people that had experience. You couldn't learn on the job as the beginning person. You could teach once the operation was underway, and they did. We know many people that started on the Western Railroad as laborers when they were just coming off the ships or just coming out of Boston. But they learned from their mentors. They learned from the people that they were working around. And by the time the railroad reached the Berkshires, reached the Hoosick area, then you, oh, I want to go back because they're not going to know what Hoosick.
Let me
Yeah.
reframe the shot. And I'm going to also pull that one in, the railroad.
Don't injure yourself now.
What's that?
Don't injure yourself now.
Well, that's the picture they was talking about, the 3D. I have a good friend in Arizona, his name is Bob Bosbell. He owns the editor of True West magazine.
Oh, True West. Love True West.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Oh, for
yeah.
God's sakes. So Bob is a good friend, and we're friends on Facebook, and